Everything I do is directed towards getting more meaning out of the content. Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Today I want to talk about flashcards and learning vocabulary. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe, click on the bell for notifications, and if you follow me on a podcast service, please leave a commentary. I do appreciate it. So I'm often asked to sort of show how I learn. What do I do? How do I study? And I've often said that learning vocabulary is the key. It's my number one goal, increase my known words total. So how do I go about doing it? What is the role of flashcards in my program of study? What is the role of, spaced repetition systems and so forth? So I'm going to demonstrate. I do most of my studying on my iPad. Some people do it on the, on their computer. Some people use LingQ on their iPhone, their Android. I do it on a tablet. I do it on my iPad, so I'm going to show you that a little later. But first, a couple of principles. First of all, I believe that when we learn words, we learn them within a holistic sort of the whole language. It's part of our becoming familiar with the language. The individual vocabulary items are connected to the language. In a way, they are not discrete. Now, here's a word for those of you who are non-native speakers. As you know, discrete, D-I-S-C-R-E-E-T, means to be, not to be too obvious in what you're doing. That's discrete. Not to embarrass people or whatever. That's discrete in that sense. But discrete, D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E, means that it's not connected. It's separate. So vocabulary items are not discrete. They are connected. It's part of that holistic getting used to the language. Until you are comfortable and familiar with the language, the vocabulary items are not going to stick. Or they'll stick for a while and then you'll forget them. So that's the second point about vocabulary items. You're going to learn them and forget them. And if you leave the language for a while, you're going to forget more of them. But that's not a problem, because once you have learned them and then you go back in there and you relearn them and rediscover them or find them again, you do strengthen your hold on those because you see them in more and more different contexts. So it's important to learn vocabulary in meaningful, content. So that's the third thing about how I learn vocabulary. To the extent that I review vocabulary items, and I'll show you that I do this more in lists than in flashcards, I do it connected to content. So you'll see when I demonstrate that every lesson that I'm in at LingQ, every content item, I will review the vocabulary that's connected to that content item, because basically what I want to do is get through the content item, get through that item that I'm studying and I'm looking up words and I'm listening to. And where I listen several times and still don't understand the same parts, or I look up words and when I hear them I can't remember what they mean. And so it's all, everything I do is directed towards getting more meaning out of the content without having to think about it, without having to translate. And so my review of vocabulary is specific, most of the time, specific to the content that I'm studying. But there are exceptions. I like to feel good about my language learning, and so I like to see more known words. And so because typically I have created a lot of links, some of them I've moved to status 2, in other words, I'm a little more familiar, or status 3, even more familiar, and I like to move them to known. So I will, and I'll demonstrate this as well, I will go into my vocabulary section and then isolate the status 3 words that I'm close to feeling I know, and I'll go in there and I'll move them to known. I move them to known, but I realize that many of the words that I move to known will slide back to status 3 or even status 2. It doesn't bother me. I accept the fact that I'm going to learn and forget and relearn. And the final thing I would say about my approach to vocabulary acquisition and use of flashcards and lists, and you'll see that I use lists more than flashcards, is that to me, reviewing vocabulary is just another form of exposure. I don't believe that if I review a bunch of items in an SRS system, spaced repetition system, that I'll get some kind of a permanent hold on them. I still need them within a lot of meaningful content. Also, I'm not a fan of flashcards because I don't believe the time that I spend racking my brain trying to remember, if I see a word in either in my language or in the target language and I have to remember what that means, racking my brain to try and do that, I don't find that useful. I've never found that useful. So I go through the lists as another form of exposure. Ultimately, the language has got to come in to your brain through exposure. Reading content, listening to content, or reviewing lists are all different forms of exposure. So I don't like to rack my brain using flashcards. So with that as an introduction, let me demonstrate how I do this on my iPad. And I'll come back and talk to you again. So I'm going to try to show you how I deal with vocabulary. I'm going to look at Turkish because I studied Turkish a few years ago now, and I've forgotten a lot of it. But I always feel whatever effort I've put into a language, when I go back in and relearn it, I know it better. So that doesn't bother me. So there's a number of different items in our library here, but I'm going to go to this one here, Baha Stories. Very good series in Turkish. And if you'll see the green line in some of these stories, that indicates that I've been through it once when I was working hard on my Turkish. And the gray line here indicates I haven't started on it yet. So we could look at, it doesn't really matter, but if we look at this Türkçenin bölgelere göre kullanımı. I must admit I don't understand what that is anymore. I haven't done this before. It has 74 unknown words, 93 words that I've looked up, 24% unknown words. Let's open it up and see what happens. So, bölgelere göre. By region. Okay. Kulan, maybe talk? I don't know. Use of. Kulan, use of. So, okay, I need that. So I convert now, because that phrase doesn't make a lot of sense to me, usage of Turkish by region. Oh, Türkçe, usage of Turkish by regions. So I'll also save that as a phrase. Yaklaşık is roughly, I remember that. Konuşan, yaşıyor. So, kocaman bir ülke.
Kocaman.
Huge bir ülke. Country. Okay, huge big country. So, normally if I were to go back into my Turkish, I would go through this whole lesson and I would look up doğal olarak, naturally, okay? Even if I kind of think maybe I know what konuşulan they speak.
Konuşulan.
Spoken, okay? I look them all up anyway. Bölgeden. Oh, from the region, okay? Bölge değişir. Changes. So a lot of these things I would be refreshing, things that I had once learned and have now forgotten. And going through this, reading it again, and looking up the yellow words again, it's all helping me remember. Türkçenin, the Turkish, farklı, different, bölgelerdeki, in areas, okay? And so normally if I were doing this, I would go through and I would look up all the yellow words and I would read it. I'm now in a review stage. But of course it's a new lesson, so there's also words I haven't seen before.
Telaffuzlar.
Telaffuz, okay. BBCs, I don't... I guess that's the T. Okay. So just for the sake of this video, I'll just go and hit the blue words. Konuşman, talking, that I actually knew that. Güneydoğusunda. In the southeast. Accent. All right. So normally then, having gone through this page, it's now review time. So the options for me are, I can review the page. There's 56 flashcards.
Kullanımı.
Okay. So, kullanımı. Okay. So this is like making sure I understand what I hear. But I don't do flashcards. I could. It's sometimes fun to do them, but I tend not to do them. I
Olarak.
also have 110. What are they?
Olarak.
Olarak. Olarak. Is that olarak? Yeah, incorrect. First of all. So, but I don't do flashcards because I just don't find racking my brain that useful. But there's different exercises in the flashcards. There's closed tests, but I'm not going to try and attempt this because what I do is I simply go to my list typically. Now, because I've been away from this for so long, there's a huge list of words just from this lesson because it's quite a long lesson. So I'm not going to go through this list. It's too much. It's too much. If I'm going to review these words, I'll review them page by page in the actual text. In the actual text. Reading it a second time, looking up a second time. However, one thing that can be useful to do, which I often do in other words, as sort of variety, I go to my vocabulary section, and familiar over here means that I have chosen to only look at status 3 words. Those are words that I've seen several times, and therefore I've moved them to status 3. And you'll notice here in the sort by, I tend to work with the alphabetical order. And there's a reason for that, and that is that typically you'll have common prefix. So words that begin A, B, A, R, T, abartanlar, there are exaggerators, abartile, abartile, abartior, abartiorsun, abartmak, all mean something to do with exaggerate. Açık hava, open air, açıkçası, frankly, açık, open, açık hedef haline, açık konuş. So açık means open. So you start to see relationships between words. So again, for me, vocabulary review is a form of exposure. I'm not testing myself the way flashcards tend to test you. I also wanted to show you something. Since we have added new languages, if I go to, say, because it's too difficult to do in Armenian, I can't even read Armenian, but in Icelandic, I had a quick look there, and
Mikael fer á fætur klukkan 6 á hverju morgni.
so
Hann
start
býr
from
saga
the beginning
1.
here.
Þetta sagan Mikael sem kokkur.
Okay.
Mikael fer á fætur klukkan 6 á hverju morgni.
So I have already listened to these first 2 sentences, and I've some of the words are so similar to Swedish that I don't even need to save them. But there will be a lot of blue words. Han is he. It's same as Swedish. Bur lives. Bir till, that might mean lives, but bur till means makes. So very often the phrase has a different meaning. Morgenmat is going to be breakfast.
Morgenmat.
That's very easy. Ok is and. Drekkur,
Drekkur.
drinks, coffee.
Kaffi.
So as I come across words, but han keirir,
Keirir.
drives, okay? Well, whatever. I vinnuna.
Vinnuna.
Okay, that's a word that's completely different from Swedish. And so I would typically go through here, converting the blue words to yellow, and then as I did before, I would go, if I click on this, I can see my vocabulary list. Here, there won't be as many because it's a much shorter lesson. Here, it would be helpful to go through this list. I could also, look up all the new words ahead of time if I wanted to review them before starting. But again, I don't find that quite as useful as reviewing them in the actual lesson text. Over time, as the number of blue words disappear and there's fewer and fewer yellow words, I then find it useful to look at my list as a quick way of reviewing the lesson that I've been away from for a while. So I hope that quick overview is useful. Again, I'm happy to do this again if you'll let me know what you would like to see me do on my iPad. Well, I hope that was useful. Maybe think some things are confusing. I'd be happy to clarify. If there are other aspects of how I study and how I learn languages that you would like me to demonstrate, please let me know. At any rate, there you have a peek into how I study vocabulary. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.